I'm Dr. Marcello Sbrocca, and in this video I'm going to be talking about practicing and how to prepare pieces of music. Now, I'm not going to touch upon every single detail that there is to practicing and preparing music, but I'm going to touch upon what I believe are some of the main points. So to start, I'm going to talk about what I believe, generally speaking, are the main skills that you need to play music well. So, to me, it breaks down into three main categories. Number one is your ability to understand what it is that you're listening to. And that can be a wide range of things. If you're playing by yourself, knowing what it is that you're listening to could be knowing whether or not you're playing in tune, knowing whether or not you're playing with the right kind of sound, knowing whether or not you're playing with good time or playing correct rhythms, or you're playing what it is that you are wanting to play, Or if you're playing with other people, it could be, if you are listening to the other person or the other people that you're playing with, can you tell where the pulse is? Do you know where everybody is in the piece of music that you're playing? Can you tell if you are in tune with them or not? So that can be, again, a very wide variety of things. But that's your ability to listen to something, analyze it, and understand it. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be able to, transcribe what you're hearing note for note perfectly. It's just that, can you understand what you're listening to the degree at which it is useful to you or necessary? Similarly, and the next skill set is, can you imagine what it is that you will hear or you want to play? So that could be like you're looking at a piece of music, and you should be able to look at a piece of music and know kind of how it sounds or how you want to play it. And that could be how you want to play it yourself, or perhaps if you're playing with another person or other people, you can look at a score or something like that, and you can analyze their part. Again, it's not like you're analyzing it with Roman numerals and figured bass and stuff like that. It's just, do you look at it and generally understand it? Maybe write some of it in your part. I'll go over that later. And then when you're actually rehearsing or playing with the other people, were you able to kind of understand what to expect from them? Just to kind of keep things together for yourself. And then the last skill set is instrumental mastery. Very simple. Are you able to play your instrument well enough so that you can execute what it is that you are wanting to play, wanting to hear? Before I go on, I just want to make sure that one thing is very clear. Those first 2 points, they're just kind of different sides of the same coin. And they are purely aural, A-U-R-A-L, not O-R-A-L. They deal purely with listening and imagining sound, listening to and understanding and imagining sounds. Okay, it's purely an aural thing. It's not visual, it's not physical, it's just a listening thing. Listening and understanding and imagining. Very important. Especially for the rest of this video. And then instrumental mastery, part of that is listening, listening to yourself playing, does it sound right, so on. But a large part of, playing an instrument well comes down to the physical side of things, So just to make it even more clear, none of this is visual. Of course, if you're playing with a group of people, there might be cues, there might be a conductor or something like that, but in general, it's either aural or physical. Now, I'm going to talk about the role that etudes, scales, and tone exercises play in helping you develop those skills that I just mentioned. So, scales, etudes, and exercises, they're all there to help you get better at music so that you can more effectively play actual pieces of music. Even though an etude sometimes can be just as much an actual piece of music as a major work is, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But first I'm going to talk about scales and tone exercises. I'm not going to tell you which tone exercises or which scales to practice, but just kind of explain what their role is. So first off, scales and tone exercises are to help you with that, are to help you primarily with that third aspect that I mentioned earlier of being able to play your instrument better. A tone exercise is there to help you, play or sound your instrument better. It's helping your embouchure, it's helping your voicing, it's helping you understand how hard you should be blowing and whatnot. And then scales, they typically work on technique, moving your fingers in tandem with your voicing and your embouchure. It's putting the two together. And now I'll talk briefly about etudes, but those I'll talk more about in a minute. But an etude is just a smaller, more manageable piece of music. Like an etude is something that you should be able to do one or two of every week or two, depending on the difficulty of the scale, or of the etude. But they're there just to be, a page or half a page of music, or more or less, that you can look at and you can practice just as you would practicing a piece of music. It's just smaller. In my opinion, etudes kind of fall somewhere on a spectrum between being technique heavy and being more just like small pieces of music. Sometimes they're very dry and pretty uninteresting and are there just to serve a technical purpose. And sometimes they are there just to be small pieces of music that you can learn in a relatively small amount of time. So you can practice all the skills that you need to when preparing a piece of music. So I'll talk about etudes and preparing pieces at the same time. But now I'd like to go back to tone exercises and scales. Tone exercises, scales, and etudes all have in common many details, but one of them that you must not overlook is that you must make them musical. And the reason why is because never are we playing a piece of music and we are not being musical. That is to say, we're not trying to include or be aware of or incorporate musicality into a piece of music. We're always doing that. And so if you're practicing your scales, etudes, and exercises and you're leaving that detail out, well, you're just, nurturing a bad habit. Now, before I talk about how to incorporate musicality into etudes, it's obvious, but talking about incorporating them into scales and even tone exercises, I need to describe or give my personal definition of what musicality even means. It's a word that I find is kind of overused nowadays and consequently has lost its meaning. It's just kind of a vague idea, like it's like when somebody tells somebody else to be more expressive or something like that. It doesn't really mean that much. When you're playing a piece of music and you are really aware of what's going on musically, and you're trying to express that, trying to include that in your performance, it is not such a vague idea. It's very much something you think about, and you go and you look at the piece note by note and you figure it out. But I digress. Musicality, to me, breaks into two main categories. It's musical style and phrasing. Musical style is whatever the musical style is of the piece. You know, when was this piece written? You know, and what are the implications of that? When was the piece written? Who wrote it? If I play a Baroque piece of music, that has all sorts of implications that are very different than if I were to play a piece of pop music or a modern contemporary work or a Romantic era piece. You know, and so it's very important to understand the musical style to a piece. Sometimes it implies a lot, and sometimes it implies very little. And then, you know, based off of what you understand from the musical style of a piece, it may affect how you phrase the piece. Phrasing is an extremely important aspect of playing music. Phrasing, to me, is how we take a piece, and this is phrasing in a classical sense, not an improvised jazz sense. Not that I want to go too much into that, but phrasing to me is like how you take the piece and you break it up, you know, to smaller and smaller pieces. You know, you have the whole piece, then you have maybe the form, then you have some larger chunks, then you have the phrases, and then sometimes you have subphrases, and then you have motives. You know, and it's understanding, how does this piece work? How is it broken up? Where does material come back, and so on? And then on top of that, how are you playing each phrase? Not only how are you playing each phrase, but how are you playing each phrase in the context of the whole piece? You know, what I mean by that is, where are you putting emphasis? You know, where are you not? Where are you maybe speeding up a little bit? Where are you maybe kind of slowing down a little bit? You know, and how does the musical style influence how you phrase the work? That really is, you know, the difference between performers, how they choose to incorporate musicality or how they choose to phrase a piece. You know, it's not blatantly said very or often enough, but when you play a piece of music, you are playing your interpretation of that piece of music. There is no such thing as playing a piece of music and it not carrying your imprint. Whether you want to or not, when you play a piece of music, you are playing your interpretation of it. Even if you have two people who studied with the same teachers, are from the same place, they're the same age, they play the same instruments, so on and so forth, even if they both say that, you know, they're going to follow what the composer wrote as closely as possible, you're still going to be left with two different interpretations, two different performances of that piece. It's an inescapable aspect of playing music. So when you're playing a piece of music, whether you're aware of it or not, you are deciding how it is that you're interpreting the piece. And that's why musicality, you know, musical style and phrasing is so important. And that's why it needs to be incorporated into everything, because we are always thinking about it. So, that being said, how does musicality show up in scales and tone exercises? In Études, it's much more obvious because they're just smaller pieces of music. We'd go through the same process, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But with tone exercises, we'll start there. How do I incorporate musicality into tone exercises? Well, first off, there's no musical style to a tone exercise. But there is a sense of phrasing to it. Phrasing with tone exercises, to me, is just adding a sense of direction to the tone exercise. You know, I'm not just playing on and off. It's like I'm kind of leading into the note and then dying away from it, like this. So you see, I'm adding direction to it. It's not just an on and off thing. It's not robotic. It's not sterile. You know, there always needs to be direction to what you're doing. And similarly, and also, before I forget, you know, there's no breaking in the sound when I do that. I talk about, in my last video, I spoke about improving tone and ease of playing, and how important it is that there's no breaks in the sound. And in order for there to be a phrase, or in order there to be effective direction in notes you're playing, there can't be any breaking. Just as I played, there was no cutting out or jolty movements. It was like one movement, almost like I'm breathing in and breathing out. And we'll do the same thing with scales. Now, obviously with scales, there's more than one note. And I'm not going to tell you what scales to play. That is a complicated topic. You can go down a deep rabbit hole with scales. You can play scales too much. You can do too many different kinds of them. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about when you play scales, what's important. We typically are working on technique in scales and an evenness to sound, evenness in rhythm and whatnot. But to me, as important as all of those details are, when we're playing a scale, we're phrasing an arc. It's just something that goes up and down. It's a simple movement, a simple motion. It's not some up and down, it's not. Right, as even as that was, it was unmusical and it had no phrasing to it, which means it's basically useless to practice it like that. To me, a scale should be slightly uneven. It's very subtle. It's not uneven in the sense that I don't know what I'm doing, but it's it's more gradual, the unevenness. I'll show. There's no need to exaggerate it. I don't need to, greatly speed up as I go up and then slow down a lot. But it's very subtle. Okay, it's a gesture. So anytime you're playing scales, it needs to be like that. And that to me is why scales that are played legato are more important than articulated scales. I am not saying you should not practice scales with articulation. That's very important. But it's very easy to cover up, an unevenness, a break in the sound when you're articulating. I find it's very hard to play your scales perfectly legato. But if you can do it, then you can basically articulate the scale pretty easily. Especially, to me, the most important kind of scales to practice are legato scales, that being number one. And number two would be scales where every note is articulated. That's very important. But the legato one is so important. There can't be any breaks, any unevenness that isn't gradual or natural or good for phrasing, good for direction. Okay. So before I go into etudes and scales, I just want to also clarify that the tone exercises and scales, they're very much, not entirely, but they're very much for that last aspect of those three skills I gave earlier. Understanding what you're hearing, being able to imagine what you want to play or hear, and instrumental mastery. They're very much for instrumental mastery. They help you play your instrument better. And so when we go now on to scale or etudes and pieces of music, now we're starting to incorporate everything. It's physical and aural. We're imagining, we're trying to understand, and we're trying to play, which I'm going to explain. Okay. And then after that, I'm going to talk about metronome and tuner and stuff like that. Anyway, etudes and pieces, to me, they're in the same category. A piece of music might require more steps, but nonetheless, it's the same idea. So now I'm going to talk about, the steps you should take in preparing a piece of music or etude. So when you're preparing, and from now on I'm just going to call Études pieces of music because they're the same thing. They're just, again, smaller, more manageable. Maybe they're a little more academic and dry, but it's the same, you go through the same process. So number one, what is a musical style? You know, is this a modern piece, you know, that has a lot of contemporary elements to it? Is it a piece of pop music? Is it a romantic era piece? Is it a Baroque era piece? A classical era piece? Is it jazz music? Is it, you know, mariachi band music? You know, whatever it is, you know, identify that first. Next, you know, and decide or discover or research what kind of is the musical style, and what would that imply for you as the interpreter or performer of that work. The next step is so important, and that is go through the piece and make sure that you understand everything. Are there any rhythms that are, and that's the most common one, are there rhythms that you don't understand? Do you not know where the beat is throughout the piece? Do you not understand some of the time signatures? Those are the most common issues, you know, and from there you can then look at, you know, are there any kind of extended techniques in the piece? You know, is there some kind of weird notation you don't understand? But all of those elements, what's important about them and the musical style is they're done without the instrument. It's a waste of time to try and practice a piece of music if you don't understand what you're looking at. It will take you 5 times as long to effectively get started on a piece if you don't understand the rhythms. If the notes are so high that you don't know what notes they are. Okay, so spend time with just the music and without your instrument. And if you need to, you know, spend time like clapping the pulse and singing the rhythm. Some pieces you may not have to do this at all, but some pieces out there are very complicated, and you may spend like a week or two with just the score because of how challenging some of the rhythms are. And there's some pieces also that you may have to kind of get started on before you even know what to concern yourself with. The next step, or rather this is a part of that second step, but it's like if the piece is with more people than just yourself, look at their part. And this may take a lot of experience to do well, but it is very valuable to look at the other person's part or the other people's part and write into your part, you know, sections that you think you will need to be aware of. You know, if I get to a rhythmically challenging section, or rather a very bare section, I might want to write in the rhythms of the other person or other people to kind of know what to listen for when I get there. Okay, this is playing on that element I mentioned earlier of, you know, can you imagine what it is that you think you'll be hearing or want to play? You know, we look at the piece of music and we look at it to understand the rhythms, you know, and all the other details. Do I understand this? Do I have an idea of how this might sound? You know, and then when I write in the other person's part, it's like, this is going to help me when we're rehearsing the piece, better understand what it is that I'm listening to. Okay? Whereas the scales and the études and the exercises might help you be more prepared to practice it so that you can focus more on the listening aspect of things and not so much on the technical aspect. Okay. And so I've spoken about, you know, in talking about preparing pieces, I've spoken about what's the musical style, you know, going over the piece to make sure you understand it. You know, if there's another person's part, looking at that. Of course, you're not going to really have that with études. But then the last part is something that you'll try to do in the beginning, but more likely than not, it's something that you'll do over time, which is understanding the phrasing of the piece, how it breaks down, and how you want to play it. You know, going back earlier to what I said about you're the interpreter of a piece of music. You're playing your interpretation of a piece of music. As you practice the piece, you're going to be developing your interpretation of it. You're going to be developing, you know, how you're going to phrase each phrase, where you're going to put emphasis, where you're not, where or if you're going to speed up or slow down, and all of those details. And again, you want to do some of that ahead of time just to kind of get going, you know, and you don't want to go in completely blind. But at the end of the day, it's something that will develop over time, whether it's over the period of time that you're practicing it or over the lifetime of performing that piece. Okay, now I'm going to talk about metronomes and tuners. A metronome and a tuner, or a drone, or something like that, they are there to help you, not with technique. They are not there to help you with technique. They're to help you with those first two skills I mentioned. Understanding what it is that you're listening to, and imagining more accurately what it is that you should be hearing or want to play. So let's start with the tuner because it's more simple. Unfortunately, with tuners, they are designed to be looked at, making them, in my opinion, useless. Tuners are useless. They are not beneficial to you. Okay, as I've tried to make very clear in this video, nothing in music is visual other than cues, but you don't need to really practice that. You're trying to, you know, with the scales, etudes, and exercises, and metronomes, and drones, and things like that, you're using all of those things to get you better, partially, you know, playing the instrument better, not with the metronome and the tuner, the other aspects, yes, but you're trying to improve your ability to understand what you're listening to and imagine more accurately what it is that you want to hear or play. Okay, so it has to be working that listening part and that listening and analyzing part of your brain. If it's not working that part of your brain, it's not helping you. I cannot stress how unbelievably important that is. So when you play with a tuner, it's not doing that. One could argue that when you play in tune and you center the needle in the dial, that you should be listening for what the correct pitch is, and that should help you. But it doesn't work that way, in my opinion. What's much more beneficial is hearing something else, whether it be a piano or a drone. I prefer a piano. I have a piano here. It's much more beneficial to be listening to something and then trying to match it. Either trying to match it in real time or playing something, listening to it, and then trying to imitate it. That is so much more beneficial. That is working that part of your brain that I'm drawing your attention to. I cannot stress that enough. You have to be training that part of your brain that listens. You have to spend time just listening and asking yourself, what am I hearing? Does this sound right? You know, when I play a note on the piano and then I play a note on my saxophone, do they sound like they're lining up? You know, and that's very relevant because when you play with a pianist, you're playing with other people, you're always adjusting in real time. Okay? And pitch is never perfect. It can be pretty good sometimes, but you're always listening, you're always adjusting, and just because you hit the center of a dial with a tuner does not mean that you're going to be in tune when you get on stage and play with other people. So that's very important. And that is again why I don't use a tuner. I use a drone, or I prefer a piano. And you can get a piano on your phone too, very easily, and it's free. And if you're so in tune with listening to something and matching it, then it doesn't matter if you're playing in 440 or 441 or 442, or playing with an out-of-tune piano, or you're playing with a musician who's at a super high level. You can always adjust, and that's the key. Next, I'm going to talk about metronome. A metronome is similar to a tuner in that unfortunately, they are designed to be looked at. whether it's a flashing light or a bar that moves side to side, and you have to make sure that you don't use them that way. You have to take a metronome and you have to hide it behind a piece of paper or plug headphones in it or put it behind you or something. You do not want to be looking at a metronome. Okay, you should be listening. And this is an important thing to understand here. A metronome in general is used for temporal and rhythmic accuracy. Okay, it gives you a sterile, perfectly accurate beat. Okay, and either it's showing you, what 120 beats per minute sounds like versus 115 beats per minute, or it's something that you can play with to make sure that the part of your brain that imagines what it is that you want to play is accurate. You might think you're playing with good time, but then you play with your metronome and you find out that you're rushing. Or you play with the metronome and you realize that you had a rhythm wrong because things aren't lining up correctly. That's when you use a metronome. Okay, it's to help you align the imagination you have in your head of what you're going to play. That's what a tuner and a metronome are both for. They're to help you, or a drone or a piano. They are there to help you work that part of your brain that is trying to imagine what you want to play. And then when you play with the metronome, you're listening to it and you're trying to understand, am I playing with it or not? Where am I getting off? When I play, with a drone or something like that, I'm listening and I'm trying to go, am I in tune or not? Am I sharp? Am I flat? Okay? So, it's an aural thing. I'm listening. Okay, it has to do with lining up your imagination with reality. And you're not always going to want to play perfectly in line with a metronome. As I'm talking about earlier with phrasing, sometimes we speed up a little bit and slow down. We add a little bit of rubato into a piece of music. That's what makes something more musical. We just use the metronome and the drone to help us kind of get things more in line. And I want to say one more thing about metronomes and tuning devices before I move on, which is that metronomes and tuning devices are much like, how a craftsman of some sort would use a ruler or different kinds of measuring devices. They use them, they know how to use them correctly, but no matter what, and this is an extremely important thing to keep in mind, no matter what, you must spend time at the end of the day without them. The craftsman will take whatever object they're making, whether it's out of wood or, a shoe or something, and they take a step back and they just look at it. Without the measuring devices, without any of that stuff, and they just look at it and they ask themselves, does this look right to me? And you need to spend time when you play doing the same thing. Just spend time listening to your playing, whether it's a recording or in real time, and asking yourself, does this sound right? And you could ask yourself, is it the rhythm? Is it the tempo? Is it the pitch? Is it my ability to play the instrument? But it's more important to think of what you're listening to as, does it sound right or does it not sound right? Okay, that's what you need to get in tune with, and it's a listening thing. Okay? And now, the last section, I'm going to talk about a couple of the practice techniques that I use. I'm just bringing up a couple because I think they're relevant in this video. You may not find them to be helpful, that's up to you, but these are some that I have learned over the years. So I'm going to talk about three. The first one's going to be without a metronome, and the second one is going to be with one. Okay, so let's say you're playing a piece of music, or a scale, or an etude, or even a tone exercise, and you find that it's too difficult. It's too difficult because maybe it's too many things at once, maybe the rhythms are too complicated, or maybe it's technically too challenging for you, or you can't quite figure out the voicing in your embouchure of how to play something effectively. What do? Well, it's simple. You just slow it down. You slow it down, which that of course sounds very obvious, but let me explain. You slow it down as much as you need to so that you can still incorporate all of the details into it. Okay? That's extremely important. Some people, they're like, oh, I'm going to practice this, but I'll add the dynamics in later. I'll add the articulations in later. I'll start thinking about how to play it musically later. No, you won't. If you play how you practice, and if every time you practice you're not incorporating those elements, then you're not going to when you eventually go to play it. Okay? But that can be very difficult, even when you slow it down. Let's say you take a really fast passage and you slow it down, dramatically, and you're playing it unbelievably slow, and it's still too hard. What do you do then? Which that's not unusual. What you can do is you can kind of play the passage in a kind of rubato way, which is where you gradually slow down and speed up as you need to, as you see fit. So you're not abruptly slowing down or abruptly speeding up. That would show that something is not quite right. So it has to be smooth and connected. It's the same thing for scales. If you're finding a scale to be too difficult, you slow it down. And if you get to a part of the instrument that's really problematic, gradually slow down into it. And as long as you're playing smoothly, it's okay if you then speed back up. Okay, if you hit a section and it's too hard and you just immediately stop, then it's not right, and you're not going to benefit from it. You have to be able to play something all the way through smoothly, even if you slow down and speed up gradually. Some people use an exercise called beat displacement. I believe you can even see this in a book by Jean-Marie Landex, a very famous and incredible classical saxophonist. The book is called Exercices journaliers, and in it he shows that if you take like a string of notes and you move the beat around, it can make you better at playing. I'll demonstrate. I'm just going to play the beginning of a scale. I'm going to play it normally, and then I'm going to do the beat displacement. So normally it'd be like this. With beat displacement, it would be like this. So you see they're like, instead of it being 4/16 notes, they're going dotted 16th note, 32nd note, dotted 16th note, 32nd note. And then they're flipping it around and going 32nd note, dotted 16th note, 32nd note, dotted 16th note. I do not like that way of playing. Personally, I did that for a couple years because I was told to do it, and it may have helped me a little bit, but the reason I am kind of against that exercise is because I believe that it just introduces tension into your playing. Anytime you're doing anything on the instrument, if you want it to be effective, if you want to get better, if you want to be able to play faster, if you want to be able to play with a more beautiful sound, if you want to get better at listening to things, you must be calm. And if an exercise or a way of playing makes you tense up, you need to figure another way out of how to do it. So that's my personal feeling. I don't like that beat displacement. I'd rather just play something slowly. Connected. That's much better. Okay, now I'm going to talk about how I use a metronome. Now, I remember I came up with this exercise several years ago. I was somebody who had a lot of difficulties playing with good time and accurate rhythms, and it was very difficult for me. And so that's how I came up with this exercise. Now, some people say that if you want to play with better time, you should take the metronome, and let's say if you're playing in 4/4, that you should put it on every other beat. You should put it on 1 and 3 or 2 and 4 if it's a 4/4 passage. I think that is a terrible way to practice. I even recall in an interview with the great Michael Brecker, a jazz saxophonist. I'm a classical saxophonist, but I still love jazz. And he talks about how he hated that exercise because he would either rush or drag, and it would make him, disappointed. And I don't like it either. I don't think it actually helps you. Again, we're using a metronome to help us align our imagination and our understanding of what we want to hear and what we are hearing. Okay? Keep that in mind. Instead of taking a division of beats away, so instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, you go 1, 3 or 2, 4, I add a layer onto it. So instead of having 4 beats per measure, I do 8. Okay, so it makes it extra precise. And now you might be thinking, well, that's going to be so many beats, it's going to be so hard to listen to what's going on and understand, what's happening. Which is yes and no, and that's part of it. Even though I'm adding twice as many beats on, or I'm dividing the beat up once, you slow it down just as I did with the last exercise. You slow it down as much as you need to so that you can actually do it and do it in a calm way. This can be very difficult, this exercise, or this practice technique. I use it when I'm having difficulties playing evenly, or if I'm having difficulties playing rhythms accurately. If I keep getting off somewhere. But again, what you're doing when you play with a metronome is you're trying to imagine your part on top of the metronome. Just as when you play with somebody else, you're trying to understand their part and understand your part, and you want to know how they fit together, which is an aural thing. I'm trying to imagine the two together. How does it sound when they're together? And it's the same thing playing with a metronome. And so when you take the metronome and you divide it up again, or once, and if a piece is in 3/8, then it's going to be divided up, into 3. You're going to have it per every eighth note instead of every dotted quarter note. But what you're doing is you're forcing yourself to think more precisely about what you're playing. And you may have to play it extremely slow, and it may take a while to be able to do this. It's like telling a computer to all of a sudden do twice the amount of work. Okay, so it can be very tedious and consequently very frustrating to do this. But I promise you that when you then put it on the regular beat, or you do the exercise where you take a division of beats away, you will feel free and it will be a lot easier. So it took me a long time to figure that exercise out, but I stand by it, and I think it's one of the most beneficial exercises you can do with a metronome. Now, the last practice technique that I'm going to explain before I wrap up is a very simple one. And that is, if you're playing a piece of music, or you're practicing to go, improvise with a jazz group, or you play in a mariachi band or something, you must, every single time you practice, you must practice running the music that you're playing all the way through. Do not wait for the week of the performance to start running a piece through. Do not wait to be playing in front of somebody or your teacher or whatever to finally be running a piece through. You need to run your pieces through every single time you practice. Okay, it will help you play them better because you will know only from practicing or running a piece all the way through, you will notice certain issues that you have. Whereas when you only break a piece up and work on it that way, which is important too, you're not putting it all together. You're not knowing what the difficulties might be when you actually go to run the piece through. And lastly, when you run a piece through, or you run the pieces through you're playing, through every single time that you practice, then when you go to perform or rehearse, it's just another day, and you're much more comfortable. So that is, of all the practice techniques, that's the most beneficial one. I'm not saying you don't break the piece down and work on it section by section. I'm just saying that as exhausting as it is, you must spend time in every practice session running your pieces through. And with that, I conclude this video. If you have any questions or comments at all, please leave them down below. and thank you so much for watching.